Right, where do I start? Okay, I got into audio recently, in the last kind of 5 years, specifically game audio. I was one of those kids, when I was in high school, he said to me, what do you want to be when you grow up, when you leave school? I went, I want to be a rock star. And he went, well, you're good at science. So I went off and did applied biology, worked for years. And a few years ago, I'm like, I'm going to do the thing that makes me happy. I've been producing electronic music for about 20 years. My partner's a game designer, so I kind of got dragged in, and it's fine by me because I really enjoy doing this. Okay, so what arrow keys? That's right. Right. So game audio. I started thinking about the history of audio in games, and sort of. I use all these tools and these really cool things, these cool instruments, and I can do some amazing things with sound. And going back, like they didn't have all those tools, so I thought, well, where did it all start? And did a bit of research and watched this really amazing documentary called Beep, which if you haven't watched it, you really, really should, because it's really important about how sound is used in games. But yeah, you. Spot the audio nerds. There's probably only 3 of us in the room. So. And you'd think, you're going back to the 70s, but no, it goes way before that, back into this era, the old Victorian penny arcades. This is actually one near where I grew up. This is in a town called Southport, and I spent many, many days in summers pushing pennies into those slots just to hear it all. Play with the noises and killed an afternoon when we were bored, put it that way. A lot of these they're very mechanical, and it's basically you're putting things in and levers hit bells and all that sort of stuff. A lot of the time they were set up so that they were considered gambling, a bit like loot boxes. They were kind of considered gambling, so people put signs up saying that you're putting the money in on the express interest of hearing the music, because they would play the music. They would, have these kind of things, these strange machines that you just put money in. They do things, and I don't really understand half of them. This is going back a long way. So, but then there was an evolution back in the 30s to 50s. All of a sudden, you've got pinball machines, and light and sound is a big part of that. Excuse me. They're a big part of the interaction. You hit a button and bells light, ding, and things light up. But then we get into the modern era. This is all mechanical technology, and all of a sudden, you to get into the video games era, you start to go electronic. And it started with this. Oh, I should turn the volume up. There we go. There isn't sound at the beginning. There we go. Woo! Well, it's the classic sound. You instantly recognise it, and that's part of the integral. This is part of the game experience. Is that sound? I'm going to turn that down a bit so that we can talk without. I'm not having to talk over it. So yeah, what happened there was Pong's designer, Alan Alcorn, was given the challenge by, was it Nolan Dabney, I think, the CEO of Atari. Dabney wanted it to boo and hiss whenever someone missed a point or whatever. But the technology just didn't exist then. So what Alcorn did is he got a video sync generator, which is a little box about yay big nowadays. You can pick them up for like $10 on eBay, and what that does is produce an electronic signal. A little sine wave, essentially, which when you hook it up to a speaker, makes a noise, and that was the noise. And it worked. It was nice and simple and effective. And that's kind of all you really needed at the time. And that kind of kick-started the era of putting sound into video games. What they then started to do is work out how to, we need to electronically produce these sounds, and they started building chips. Now, at the beginning, these chips were very, very basic. They would have maybe 5 channels. 4 channels would produce a single square wave, and 1 would produce noise, and that's all you've really got to produce your music. And it's very, very limiting to work out how you're going to, okay, well, we can use 1 as a bass, that noise can be drums, and everything else is kind of rhythm and melody, and you really have to think about how you're going to produce your sounds. For those that don't know what a sound wave sounds like, I actually have a synthesizer on my phone. There's an app for that. Let's see if I can. So that's a sine wave, the classic beat. I mean, obviously that sounds like a video game. Yes, I do want to exit. Thank you very much. So yeah, that was kind of the 80s, and that led into the classic golden era of video games. That Space Invaders, Pong, Pac-Man, all that kind of thing. They're generated with sound trips, very simple noises mixed together, creative things. But there was a bit of an evolution from that went on. Sorry, I've got cards. My son does public speaking in school, and he got me onto this trick. It's really, really handy because my memory is awful. The amount of times I've gone on to talk and gone, what was I going to say? Anyway, so yeah. The evolution then came in kind of 1986. It kind of started in 1973 with work a guy named John Chowning did at Stanford, and he licensed the work to Yamaha, and then that's called FM Synthesis. And this was the first game that released. Oh, what? Again, it's not showing that on this side. There we go, that'll do. So yeah, this is FM Synthesis. Now it's a much more complex form of synthesis. What it does is it produces a sine wave, but that sine wave is modulated by another sine wave. And you can have multiple sine waves modulating all the sine waves. So they develop what they call algorithms. And it produces much more complex sounds like this. But as luck would have it, I have an FM synthesizer on here. All right, we're ready. You ready? So yeah, FM synthesis. All of a sudden you got this new powerful technology, but it still only has 4 channels. So you're still having to get creative with how you're producing all this sound. So yeah, anyway, FM synthesis. Then there came the 90s era, the PC era, and all of a sudden you've got CD storage. Your storage is much more. You've got sound cards with 17 FM chips on it, all producing 19 channels, much greater range. All of a sudden, there's no restrictions anymore. In fact, you've even got things like sampling technology, so you can sample sounds and change them in real time in the game. But that was just the start. We haven't even found the full power of game audio yet, because it's used in many different ways. The style of the music can fit the game or not. It really does need to fit the game, otherwise it's not going to work. So, if you've got a cyberpunk game, you kind of want really electronic beats, like All Walls Must Fall is a good example for that. You can use the tempo to change people's moods. You can fade the music out as the player goes in the wrong direction. Fade it back in again as they move back in the right direction. Things like that. You can use things like vertical and horizontal sequencing. That's when, like vertical sequencing, you get music and you split it up into stems and you kind of stack one on top of the other and build up the music as you're playing. Or horizontals, when you've got chunks of music and you can swap them around to change the tempo, you can change the feel. You can use things like leitmotif. A good example of leitmotif is in Star Wars. Whenever Darth Vader walks in and you get the Imperial March playing, that's leitmotif. It's a recurring theme associated with a character or a circumstance. So, and it applies into UI and UX feedbacks and sound design. Okay, a little thing, my favorite bit of sound design. Sound design, okay, you're manipulating sounds to create something, a feedback of some kind. You can, apply screams or beeps or whatever. A lot of them are stock sounds. Like everyone heard of the Wilhelm scream? Yeah, everyone's heard of that. Another famous one is the Howie scream. Give it some sound. Watch this. That's the Howie scream. It gets better. It gets better because Ben Burt really made the Wilhelm scream famous. He also did the same with the Howie scream, but not in the way you think, because the Howie scream's also... You'll never be able to unhear that now. It's funny because when you start doing this sort of thing, you start noticing where sounds have been reused. I was watching The Expanse, and it was like the second episode, and they get onto the Martian battleship, and they get attacked and what have you, and the alarm's going off, and I went, hang on, that's the same alarm noise that you use on the UNSC Pillar of Autumn in Halo 1. So yeah. So what I like to do when I'm talking to game designers is I like to use the concept of the sonic palette. I had to. No, you wouldn't you? So yeah, the sonic palette, it's a concept that's been around for a while in the sort of the music and compositional world. And in there they kind of define it as the entire tonal range or color of an instrument, or the entire tonal range or color of a composer's body of work. And when you extend that analogy to games, it becomes all sounds within the game. And they need to be consistent and cohesive across the board. And there's many different ways of achieving that. A good example is Portal 2. Pretty much all the sound design and the music was done with Ploug's chiptunes plugin. So there's all these chiptunes and all done with the same plugin. So you get this consistent sound board across the whole thing that just gels nicely together. And that's kind of a instance of instrumentation being the main operative for the driver of the sonic palette. Another good example, one I really like, is this. Why that works is, for my mind, is you've got this device that obviously looks technological with its glowing things and buttons and what have you, and you put this thing in, there's a dock there. But it's this fantasy environment. But the sounds capture that technological element and that fantasy element, combine them really well together. I'm not entirely sure what instrumentation or that they did to use that, to do all of that, but I think it works really, really well. I often say to people that when you're playing a game, you're looking at a screen that's a window into another world. The only part of that world that extends beyond the screen is the sound. When you're designing a game, you need to mentally place yourself in that universe and listen and imagine what you're hearing. And write that down, and that gives you an asset list that's really, really useful in the long run. So I'm kind of racing through my slides, but oh wow, it's only been 10 minutes. Okay. I forgot what I was up to now. I'm kind of getting onto the future of audio now, and VR. and spatialization and head-related transfer functions. And how do I do this? Okay. We don't really know what's possible with audio yet. What we do know is that certainly with VR, the point of VR is like the hallmark of it is reality. It needs to sound as real as possible. And it's difficult to do that with the current technology. Technology is currently evolving. There's a technique called Convolution Reverb, and that basically what they do is an impulse response. So they'll go into the space and they make it really quiet, and they'll clap, and then they'll record the clap, and then take the clap away, so they're only left with the reverb. And then they apply that reverb to other sounds, so that you can realistically model accurately real spaces. And that's going to be a really big thing in the future, and we're still learning how to do it properly. Another thing that's going to be really big is live in-engine sound synthesis, and getting the engine to generate the music and the sound procedurally as you're playing, which Chris there is doing a lot of work on. I recently worked on a project called Awake, which was taken to South by Southwest. We have the trailer for it here. It should play. Oh no, go back. Oh, hang
on. There you are, my dreamer.
Do you ever want to just sail away together?
I was discussing an alternative myth. I'll call the dramatic myth.
Why not start over right here?
This is the two of us. And we could weather just about anything, you and I.
The idea that life as we experience it's a big act.
Are you ready to come home?
And that behind this big act is the player. And the player...
Wake up.
...is you.
That's all of that. Now, if you talk to Martin, the producer, he starts going on about all the recurring themes in it. There's a storm in a teacup, and there's this glyph, and there's the fireplace, and he'll talk about those things. When we did that, we had a requirement of using the Steam audio, the Steam spatialization stuff, which was very interesting, because I had about a day to learn it. Originally, it was all supposed to be done in engine, but now all of a sudden, nope, has to be Steam. So, okay, yeah, we implemented that and started pumping it in. And I noticed very quickly that it's very limited in its realistic spatialization, and a lot of it comes down to it didn't have the right convolution reverb applied to it, because it was they were done. All the sound design was done without any reverb applied to it. It was all dry, so we're having to apply it in engine, which doesn't deliver it properly. And it's kind of a bit of a it's a nice start from Unreal, but it's not quite there yet. And that was a lot of fun. But it's a problematic thing, because an awful lot of people in the games industry don't know audio. Audio people come in and don't really know games. So there's this kind of disconnect between audio and games. So the reality is, in order for VR, in this case, to be taken seriously, people have to start teaching audio in games courses. But I've actually kind of run out of things to say now. Does anyone have any questions? Yes?
Are there any games out there at the moment that are
Yeah, All Wars Must Fall is a good one. They have this really, really good procedural generation algorithm. Now, they're basically giving it a bunch of loops, and everything in the game happens on the beat. So as you're playing, the music's constantly changing and adapting to what's happening and timing it all to be on the beat. That's a really, really good one. Just trying to think. Halo 5, actually, had a similar system. The composer produced a bunch of loops and let the engine pick from those loops adaptively as you're playing. So I saw another hand up there a minute ago. Yes? That's a good question. I think the opportunity to create that realistic environment. There's a lot of attention to detail in that goes with it, but it's VR is at its best when you can't tell what's real and what isn't, and there's a long way to go before we can actually, certainly audio-wise, produce stuff where we can't tell that it isn't real. For my mind, it's that disconnect with the audio. If that doesn't sound right, that's the first thing that gives it away. Yes?
There's a lot of games that get a lot of praise for the great soundtracks, but that usually is restricted to the music game and the game mix. As an audio person, are there any games that you would say have great sound without necessarily having a great soundtrack?
Yes. Portal 2. Portal 2 is sheer genius all the way through. For my mind, it's one of the best games ever created. Well, there was... I had other examples of this. What was Far Cry? The Far Cry series, they do it really, really well, with some exceptions. Because I've been playing them a lot recently. I'm kind of a big fan of first-person shooters. For one of the earliest examples of a good sonic palette was Quake from 1995. All the sound design, all the music was done by Trent Reznor of Nine Inch Nails. So it's got this consistent sonic palette. So that's another really good example. But with the Far Cry series, it's really good until you're running through the forest or wherever and you hear dogs barking, because it's the same bark for all the dogs. There's absolutely no variation. It's just like woof, woof, woof. That's it. And it glares. It's glaringly obvious once you hear it, and you can't unhear it. And it's infuriating. It just completely breaks reality. So, any more? Oh yeah, sorry, at the back.
So you say you're interested in procedural generation of audio and video games.
Yes.
Have you done much exploration into like the kind of procedural generated audio that happens just with normal gameplay? The interaction between all different sounds, just play it like progressing through the game.
Well, that's kind of where the sonic palette comes in, because if you start thinking of it, we're nearly time. 5 minutes, okay. If you start thinking of it being a cohesive thing, then all of a sudden you need to start thinking about how those UI feedbacks, those button presses, if you like, fit in with the music, fit in with the sound, fit in with the environment, and kind of fit in with everything else, because you want it to be, for want of a better word, as smooth as possible across the board. Because when you have one thing that doesn't quite fit, like those barking dogs, you lose that connection with the game. No? Yes?
Do you think we'll ever be at a point where the game could even be in numerical sound without any input from the real world or a microphone? So like if you had like a metal pole next to it, like a tree or something wood, could you just based off of the fact that you know that runs millimeters of wood generate a sound that would be, accurate?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, you'd have to do a lot of modeling to get the algorithms to generate that. That's not my area of expertise. You're better off talking to Chris there. They said they were going to heckle, so I'm getting my revenge. Yeah, GTA 5 does a lot of that. They synthesize, sort of 40% of the audio on the fly, straight through from the engine, so yeah. So it's starting to happen, but we're a long way to go. So, any more? Or are those at it? I think that's it. Awesome. Thank you very much.